Should you eat fruit with type 2 diabetes? Let's jump in and find out. Hi guys, quick one before we jump in. It really helps us out if you like and subscribe to the video. It puts it in front of more people, which means we can help more people like yourself. Also, if you need an extra helping hand with your diabetes or lifestyle change, head over to diabetesdietguide.com, where we offer consultancy services and extra free material. Thanks a lot. See you later. Okay, so this is one of the most common questions we get as dietitians with patients managing type 2 diabetes. Now, obviously, on one hand, fruit we know is a healthy food. On the other hand, it contains natural sugar, which in theory increases blood glucose levels. So should you be eating fruit? Should it be part of your diet? Should it be part of your lifestyle? And if so, how much, how often? These are the questions we're going to be answering, so let's jump in and take a look. Right guys, so to help answer this question, we need to have a basic understanding of the different types of sugars and carbohydrates in a diet, carbohydrates being the foods that affect blood glucose levels. We cover this in extensive detail in other videos on the channel, so if you're interested in that subject matter, look on our type 2 diabetes info page or in our channel playlist, and there'll be a lot more videos in there that can help support you. But first things first then. So essentially we have two types of simple sugars. We have glucose and we have fructose. These are the simplest forms of sugar. So when we eat food, the body wants to break down any carbohydrate containing food into its simplest form. And that means it can be used for energy. Now, the sugar that the body utilizes for energy is glucose. So even fructose, which is the natural sugar found in fruit, or the majority of the sugar found in fruit, there is some glucose, will eventually be converted into glucose. But there are other types of food that will be converted into glucose ultimately. So generally, glucose is just very simple units of sugar, individual chains or individual molecules of glucose. Okay. Now, what you can have is these individual molecules can start to join themselves up. And the longer the chains, the different type of carbohydrate we might expect to see. So, for example, starchy food like bread, pasta, rice, cereal is really just long chains of glucose-containing molecules. And typically, as those chains get longer and longer, the less sweet the food's going to become. So it doesn't mean those foods are sugary, but what it does mean is that it contains glucose at a structural level. And then when you eat those foods, the body starts to break those bonds or those chains between the glucose molecules and converts them back into the simplest units, which is individual molecules of glucose, which then means it can be utilized for energy. Same process happens with fructose, but the first thing we need to look at is how and why this is slightly different, because it affects whether or not, or it affects how the fructose is absorbed, and then that's a big consideration about how fructose will affect your blood sugars, and the first step in our journey to understanding whether or not you should be eating fruit. So step 2 on our journey then is understanding what the difference is between glucose and fructose absorption and how this might affect your blood glucose levels. So glucose, regardless of the source and how you eat it, you eat the food, it travels down the esophagus into the stomach, and then it's gradually broken down in the intestines where, crucially, it can be passed directly into the bloodstream, where it can be transported to the muscles for direct energy straight away, or the other organs of the body that require energy like the brain or the lungs, etc. Or it can go down the hepatic portal vein to the liver, where it can be redistributed back to the blood vessels for energy, or it can be stored in the liver for later as a type of glucose, but the storage form, which is called glycogen. Fructose, on the other hand, has a slightly different journey. So like carbohydrate, when you eat fructose or fruit, it will travel down the esophagus into the stomach, but then very little amounts of fructose will actually enter the circulation straight away. Most of it goes via the hepatic portal vein, goes into the liver, is then converted into glucose and to a small part a fat called triglycerides, and then is passed to the blood vessels later as glucose. As a result of this process, fructose actually has a lower glycemic index, i.e. it's absorbed more slowly than glucose. So the immediate glucose impact from fructose is lower compared to glucose. So pound for pound, if you had the same amount of fructose and the same amount of glucose, the glucose will increase your blood glucose levels more than the fructose would. Now, this isn't to say that the fructose might increase glucose levels slightly later, but it has a lower glycemic index effect. So you are less likely to get this kind of spike in your glucose levels like this. Instead, you get more of a gradual increase, which obviously means you have a lower blood glucose level compared to the quick spike. So that's more favorable and helps to keep people's glucose levels under control for a more prolonged period of time. Now, this won't be a blanket rule that all fructose-containing foods like fruit will be more slowly absorbed than foods that are directly converted into glucose, because there's some starchy foods that will be directly converted into glucose that are much slower absorbed than some fruits. But if you have foods that are just primarily glucose in their simplest form, like sweets, and if you bit into a piece of fruit, the sugars from both of those will be more slowly absorbed, typically with the fructose compared to the glucose. But as the molecules get bigger, i.e. starchy, it might be that actually the starchy food is more slowly absorbed than the fructose. But that's not the be-all and end-all, because we're going to jump into one additional concept that we need to consider. And this concept is something we blogged about before on this channel and on my website and various other places. And that is something called the glycemic load, which is basically how fast the food absorbed, the glycemic index, multiplied by how much carbohydrate there is in the first place. And it's that second factor, how much carbohydrate is in that food in the first place, that will have the ultimate or the biggest impact on your glucose levels ultimately. So when we actually start to match up different carbohydrate containing foods, and remember, sugar is just a type of carbohydrate, we can start to see stark differences. So, for example, when we look at starchy foods like rice and pasta, cereal and oats, we can see that actually the carbohydrate content is somewhere between 60 and 80 grams of carbohydrate per 100 grams. 60 to 80%. Bread's 50, potatoes about 22.5, and something like milk chocolate is about 60 grams per 100 grams. When we compare that to foods like fruit, we can see actually the carbohydrate content is much lower. So one of the foods or fruits that has one of the highest carbohydrate contents is bananas, but it's only 20 grams per 100 grams. Apples 15 and oranges 8.5, berries are roughly 7 and below. Grapes, which are typically associated with high glucose levels, are only 15, compared to 60 or 80 for pasta or rice. Now, if you consider that if you're having white pasta or rice, these foods are also very quickly absorbed. So you've got a double whammy, quickly absorbed and high carbohydrate content. Much more potential to increase your glucose levels compared to, say, an orange, which is fructose, more slowly absorbed, and much lower carbohydrate content pound for pound. So actually, fruits are less likely to increase your blood glucose levels. The other part that we need to consider is the nutrition that we're getting from these foods. Some highly processed starchy carbohydrates, they can have nutrients added to them, but they're going to be a lot less nutritionally complete or dense compared to some of the healthier options. So for example, a sugary breakfast cereal might have some nutrition added to it, but typically oats is going to be more slowly absorbed, particularly if the oats aren't cut up and milled, but instead actually remain intact. Something like seeded bread is going to be much slower absorbed compared to white bread. And something like chocolate isn't going to have really any nutrition at all. Whereas fruits, on the other hand, are very high in fiber and very rich in vitamins and minerals, our micronutrients. And it's particularly that fiber content that helps to slow down the absorption even further of these fruits, compared to some of the other foods that we might be eating, particularly if you're not someone that peels the skin off these foods. So actually, we have a triple whammy. We have lower glycemic index anyway compared to sugar. We have lower carbohydrate compared to most carbohydrate containing foods, and just generally the nutrition within them, and particularly the fiber content, slows down the absorption of fruit compared to other carbohydrate containing foods. Now, this isn't to say that these foods cannot increase your glucose levels. Of course, they can spike glucose levels, particularly if you eat enough of them. So if you have enough carbohydrate, regardless, your glucose levels might rise. But pound for pound, if you'd eaten the equivalent from, say, chocolate or perhaps white rice, they would have risen much more. And a good example of this is something like grapes, where a portion of fruit is typically a handful. Whereas most people I meet, and myself included, won't stop at a handful because grapes are quite moreish, actually will end up doing the whole punnet. And then as a result, you're getting a lot more glucose, or fructose, I should say, more sugar, more carbohydrate, than what you would normally get in a normal portion. So, of course, you can overcome this effect if you eat enough of it, but you get a lot more leeway with these fruits compared to some of the other carbohydrate containing options. And a really good example of this would be juice. So juice is actually quite a lot of sugar beyond what you'd normally get if you just ate some fruit. So if you're having some orange juice, for example, an orange is only 8.5 grams of carbohydrate per 100 grams. And you might be surprised to find out that actually orange juice generally is only about 10.5 grams per 100 grams. But here's the difference. When you have an orange, you're not having a lot of that food. So actually the portion is low. When you have orange juice, what you'll tend to do is have more than you would normally have than if you just ate an orange. So as a result, you're getting a lot more sugar in one hit than what you would have if you were just eating the fruit. So that's a good example of how actually the portion can overcome the low carbohydrate content. And also keep in mind, when we start to juice things or mash things, we increase how quickly that food can be absorbed. So orange juice is very quickly absorbed compared to especially normal fruits. So you get a really quick absorption speed, and as a result, the glucose levels have the potential to increase because essentially you've got more carbohydrate than you'd normally have in that portion, and it's absorbed quickly. So we can overcome the benefits of the fruit. And like I say, it's not to say that these can't affect your glucose levels, they're just less likely to compared to some of the other options. And this just brings me on to the last thing that I wanted to touch on, because if you Google it, it might come up, and there's a lot of podcasts that talk about it. So that juice effect is similar to what we see with a very highly processed sugar, which is called high fructose corn syrup, or glucose fructose syrup. Fructose corn syrup has lots of names, but it's all essentially the same thing, which is where we convert corn into sugar via different man-made processes. Now, it's quite a cheap sugar, it's actually quite sweet, and it's found in a lot of different foods. Now, the idea being that by having a lot of fructose in the diet, it's actually causing us to be overweight, obese, increasing glucose levels, and causing a lot of people to have fatty liver disease. And the reason being, if we just return to our little picture here, as good as it is quite simple, really. So because fructose is directly travels to the liver, where it's then converted to glucose, what you have is, if you start to have a lot more fructose than you normally would have than if you were just eating fruit, say, i.e. you're having man-made fructose syrup in high concentration in certain foods like chocolates and cakes and biscuits and sweets, or you're having a lot of it in things like juice drinks, etc., then you're starting to overload the liver here. So essentially getting too much. Now, what the body will do with that fructose is it will convert it into something called triglycerides, which is just a form of fat. And as a result, this can start to accumulate, and it can lead to fatty liver, which can then lead to conditions like fatty liver disease, which then comes with its own complications, and it's not a route that a lot of people want to take. And often, actually, in about 30%, I think the stats are, people with type 2 diabetes, they will also have some underlying fatty liver disease. It's probably a lot higher than that, they just don't scan everyone. Typically where you have one, you have the other, because they're interlinked to a certain degree. So I think we just need to distinguish out the difference between eating something quite healthy like fruits and actually having high fructose corn syrup in foods like chocolate. I don't think you need to be a rocket scientist to see the difference. So just to summarize then, should you be eating fruit with type 2 diabetes? Yes, you should be. These are low-calorie foods that don't provide a huge carbohydrate hit, which also give you a lot of fiber, which has its own health benefits, and a lot of vitamins and minerals. There's no evidence to show that people that eat fruit actually have worse diabetes control compared to people that don't. In fact, the people that eat fruit tend to have better diabetes control. And actually, before you go on to develop diabetes, the people that are eating more fruit and whole grains and pulses and beans and lentils and legumes have lower incidences of type 2 diabetes and lifestyle related diseases compared to people that aren't eating these foods. So these are good for you guys. These are the sort of foods that we want you to be eating, but we don't want you to overdo it. Of course, if you have too much of a good thing, it can still cause problems. And a story I always use is if you drank too much water, you can literally dilute yourself and drown. Sounds pretty morbid, but that's true. You can have too much of a good thing, but obviously you need water. So if that happened to someone, the conclusion then isn't don't drink water. It's actually have the right amount. Now, usually the right amount of this would be about 2 or 3 portions a day of being a handful. So these are pretty good snacks to have. 2 or 3 handfuls a day, and then you get the rest of your 5 a day minimum. Remember, 5 a day minimum fruit and vegetables is made up of those vegetables. So that's how we get there. And you should be able to quite easily integrate that into your diet with some simple tweaks. So that's kind of the conclusion, guys. Please have some fruit. It will be good for you, but don't overdo it. Hopefully that answers the question. And so we'll leave it there, and I'll see you at the next video.